I remember a particular child. She had some very, very intense and severe tantrums and meltdowns. She would also scratch and gouge her face. I began to realize how much her emotional state was connected to my emotional state when I was with her. The more stressed I became when she was in this incredible state of meltdown, the more intense her behavior would become. And it was just like this vicious cycle. I was, really intensely worked up internally. I was afraid. I was upset. And it wasn't until I began to recognize these things, I realized that if I could take some deep breaths, slow myself down, calm myself down, recognize that what was happening had nothing to do with me. When I was able to do that, and I wasn't always able to do that, we developed such a close bond that I couldn't have ever imagined. I didn't even recognize what she was capable of and the depth of the connection that we could have until I began to drop down in many ways from my head into my heart and realize that I was really there with her and with myself.
So when there are videos made for parents to help them to bring up their autistic children, most often we get things like strategies and techniques that we can use. But Andrew, I know you have a sort of more, I guess, a more holistic and a deeper way of approaching, how a parent can best support their autistic child. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Indeed, Guy, and I think that is very true. That I perhaps take a more holistic approach. There are many reasons for that, but when you talk about a holistic way of approaching moments where a child is perhaps very emotionally escalated, emotionally overwhelmed, maybe acting out in particular ways, hitting, biting, right, doing some of the things that of course can be very confusing and sometimes very terrifying, alarming for parents. As a professional community, I think we, and I say we meaning professionals, tend to focus more on specific concrete techniques, right? What are the very specific things parents can do in response? That can certainly be helpful for parents to have some idea of how to respond in different situations. But what I have found over the years is that there's a crucial foundation that is completely overlooked and often missed, which is a bit, I think, more uncomfortable for professionals to really talk about because it involves me as a professional really talking more about what's happening for me on a deeper personal level. For example, when I'm face to face with, in contact with a child who might be really overwhelmed, confused, frustrated, what I have to sometimes start with is where I am inside. How do I feel in those moments? And if I focus on that first, what I have found over the years in my own work with parents is that if I can help parents understand more and reflect more on what they may be experiencing inside when their child is doing whatever they're doing, oftentimes then parents' use of techniques, whatever they might be, can be so much more effective. But it is more challenging for many professionals to focus on those emotional aspects, especially if they're not trained psychologists. right? So whether, I'm an early childhood special educator, whether you're an educator or perhaps an occupational therapist or a speech therapist, and maybe haven't been as trained in mental health or emotional regulation and things like that, most professionals tend to kind of avoid that work of looking more inside. And so it's something that I have found so much more important and necessary in supporting parents.
So I guess you're saying that techniques can help. They can help to manage a particular moment. They can help as an emergency toolbox to use when we don't know what to do. But there's something that can make those techniques much more effective and may eventually replace the need for techniques. And that is for a parent to be reflective and aware of their own condition during a situation. Now, this might seem either very abstract to a lot of parents or really counterintuitive. Something might be going on, they just want a solution, they just want to get through to the end of it. So maybe we can walk through an example of what it might look like.
Yes.
Let's say, I don't know, let's say a child is refusing to eat a particular food. There's a food in front of them, the parent has made a meal, put it on the table, child says, I don't want this meal. How does that feed into what you're saying? I mean, there are all sorts of techniques that people might use in terms of how they might talk to a child. What might be the advantage for a parent of checking in on how they are first?
I think that's a great example, Guy, and it's oftentimes an extremely powerful one for families because, feeding our children can be very, very charged emotionally, right? There's something very, very instinctual and very primal about caring for our children in a particular way by nourishing them and feeding them. So oftentimes a lot of strong emotion can come up for families, and sometimes they're unaware of this when there's a situation where they're trying to feed their child and their child is overwhelmed, distressed, perhaps very on a sensory level, is having a really strong reaction or aversion to foods, or is just feeling stressed and overwhelmed because a child feels very out of control, that they're not sort of feeding themselves. They have no agency or control. So this can be a very challenging situation for families. So oftentimes a crucial starting point is just literally creating a safe environment for parents to just begin to talk about and think about and reflect on what may be coming up for them in that situation with their child, right? And of course, oftentimes parents don't ever have that opportunity because they're just slamming through life with their kids. And unless they actually are in therapy themselves or in some type of mental health support program, sometimes professionals won't even ask that question. What does that mean for you? What comes up for you? What is that like? Share that with me. And once parents just have that opportunity to begin to reflect, that's where some of the really powerful work begins to happen, because parents, if they've never considered those things and no one's ever asked them, all of a sudden they can have some sometimes very powerful realizations about how stressed they are, how fearful they are, how panicked they are about, oh my gosh, my child's not going to get food, something horrible is going to happen. So oftentimes just starting there with giving parents an opportunity to just reflect. And that situation, if it's a different situation, for example, if their child is hitting them or trying to bite them, what's that like for you inside, right? When that situation happens, that's always a very important starting point.
So okay, so something happens, a parent, and it might be something that a parent needs to sort of build up to and slowly learn how to do this. but a parent can check in with themselves and really just understand how they feel. You know, if it's about food, just start to understand the panic that they feel, which might not normally be acknowledged, either because they're believing that it's their job to look after their child and they're not allowed to prioritize themselves and have their own feelings. Or it might be just that they think that they've got to get through the situation and they don't have the time or luxury to think of this. But if they can start to become aware of how they're feeling, what can they then do with that? You know, how could that help them to manage that situation with the child?
Yeah. So mm, I think the first step is, again, is more awareness. And I will say, I like to use myself as a professional as an example, because I feel like sometimes professionals we can hide a bit behind the techniques and not necessarily be as authentic with families about our own examples. So for me, as the examples that I would always use is like, if I'm working with a child and that child is sort of coming after me and trying to bite me, or if I'm offering some food to a child and they, push the food away, or throw, sort of give me some indication that they don't want the food, or sometimes my first response or reaction can be like, I can literally feel my heart rate increasing, right? Substantially. I can feel myself getting really hot or warm and very, very stressed or anxious, right? I can feel my own anxiety rising to the surface about, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? I want to have a connection with this child, and they're pushing me away. Or so what I've had many years of practice doing as a professional is learning how to be with myself in those moments of where my first response to a particular like behavior is, oh my gosh, what, I'm stressed, I'm anxious, I'm not sure what to do. And to just, honestly, the first step, and this is, I think, really crucial for many parents, is to just take some deep, slow breaths, right? To do whatever I need to do to kind of um, ground myself and slow myself down, so that I can then, in many ways, think more clearly and come up with a response or a solution. And of course, this is all happening very quickly. It's not like I'm going to take 5 minutes to close my eyes and meditate in a difficult situation. But we certainly know from now, neuroscience, mindfulness, we have this whole body of knowledge that talks about the importance of slowing our central nervous systems down, so that ultimately we're able to respond in more effective ways to a whole variety of situations. And again, this kind of first step oftentimes gets overlooked when we focus just on, here are the 5 things to do,
Yes.
in terms of actions, when my child is either not refusing food, or they're trying to hit me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Can you think of an example of where that's happened to you when you've been working with a child, um, and having that self-awareness has led you to handle the situation in a way that's more successful than it would have been if you hadn't?
Absolutely. Um, and I mean, it's important to have incredible honesty and transparency about this, Guy, because I think in our field, professionals oftentimes, feel this incredible sense of responsibility to really offer help in a in a way to families that really does support them. And there's a lot of pressure on professionals to come up with answers and solutions. And so I think sometimes as professionals, we put enormous pressure on ourselves, and we have a system that puts pressure on us to, in some ways, be superhuman in these kinds of situations, which makes no sense, because the message that parents end up getting from professionals is sort of, if you know, if this goes badly, it's your fault, because I, the professional, am telling you this wonderful
Yeah,
solution to use, and if you can't implement it, that's your fault.
yeah,
Instead of me as a professional saying, I've been in hundreds of situations or thousands of situations with children, and have lost my patience
yes, yeah,
and
yeah,
have blown it.
yeah,
And that's important to acknowledge, and to be honest about, and reflect on, and be able to have that kind of transparency with parents. Um, so I'll just pause there, because I think there's something that just needs to, that is so important for families to understand, about that, because I do think parents get the message from professionals that when things aren't going well, it's their fault. And professionals make just as many mistakes,
yeah.
or below it. And oftentimes we don't frame it that way.
And I guess it's about self-compassion, isn't it? As well, you know, not just self-reflection, but self-compassion. Like, we're not going to get everything right. And parents of autistic children who are not autistic themselves, and who are parenting a child who they don't intuitively understand, because that child has a different way of thinking and processing than they do, they have an enormous amount to deal with, and they have uh, a huge job, a huge learning process that most parents don't need to go through. Most parents have their own learning process, which is massive enough. For parents of parenting children of a different type, might also be autistic parents, or parenting non-autistic children, it's a huge mountain to climb on top of the traditional parenting mountain. So that, yeah, it's a really important point. Parents need to be really compassionate with themselves. And when we're talking about learning these new approaches, and this is a new approach, I think, that you're putting forward, isn't it, about parents being aware of their own, of what's going on for them, not to take that as an extra task, an extra burden, but but a suggestion that's being offered as a way that might loosen things up and might make things a bit easier. And I was wondering, you know, to go back to the last, what we were talking about before, and it's good you took it in this direction, it's very important. But is there an example you can give of where you've given an example of where you didn't, where you weren't self-reflective, and that led to you being impatient? Do you have any examples of where you have been self-reflective, and that's led you to manage a situation better for the child?
Yes. Some of the most powerful examples that come up for me, Guy, when you ask that question, go back some years, because I had, long stretches of sort of many years when I was working, at a school for, developmentally disabled, young people. And, um, at that school, I had the opportunity to work with some, uh, children, some of whom were autistic, some of whom had a range of other, developmental challenges, but also some of whom had some very intense, difficulties, regulating their systems. And so we're oftentimes completely overwhelmed and in real states of crisis and meltdown, and we're coping with those states. They were very much in fight or flight mode, and acting out very aggressively. I think they were, now again, at the time, I didn't understand what I understand now about development and sort of behavior and our central nervous systems. But I remember, I'm going to go to a particular, child that I consider one of my greatest teachers. And I will, I will call her Sherry, even though that was not her name. She had some very, very intense and severe tantrums and meltdowns where she would not only lash out towards me or whoever was around her, but she would also scratch and gouge her face, and in very intense ways, and draw blood. And she was, again, in an incredible state of dysregulation. And when I say she was one of my greatest teachers, what I remember having to begin to experience and practice was I began to realize how much her emotional state was connected to my emotional state when I was with her. And what I really started to recognize was that the more stressed I became when she was in this incredible state of meltdown, the more intense her behavior would become. So in many ways, the more overwhelmed and intense her acting out behavior became. And it was just like this vicious cycle. So she would, the more she would lash out and try to gouge, the more I would, the harder I would try to stop her. And I was, really intensely worked up internally. I was afraid. I was upset. I was, in many ways, confused. And it wasn't until I began to recognize these things and get some, actually at the time, get some counseling, where I had a chance, and I was fortunate enough to have this opportunity, to be able to access support where I could talk about what it was like being with her and how hard it was for me to watch her suffer and struggle, and also to target me, because I was like, I love you, I'm trying to help you. Why are you coming after me? And as I got to process that and understand that, I realized that if I could take some deep breaths, slow myself down, calm myself down, recognize that what was happening had nothing to do with me. She was just in an enormous state of crisis. As I did that, and this was probably over a period of weeks. This wasn't like all of a sudden I just said, I'm calm now. It's easy, right? This was a part of, I had to reflect, become more aware of what was underneath my own reactions. And then I had to be able to tell myself in the moments when she started to escalate, this is going to be okay. We're going to get through this. I'm going to get through this. I'm going to be an anchor here, right? In both of our storms, right? And so I had to practice telling myself those things consciously in order to get through. And when I was able to do that, and I wasn't always able to do that, even when I knew, sometimes if I'd had a bad morning and I didn't get enough sleep and things were just not going well for me during the day, it was much harder for me to remember to take those breaths and to tell myself those reassuring things. So this is I think what parents struggle with all the time is this, I can't be calm. I'm just too stressed, too overwhelmed. And that's okay, right? It's okay to have that intention to want to respond differently and just, oops, I didn't do it. But there's always tomorrow. There's always in an hour. There's always, the next interaction, whatever it is. And I just think, again, this kind of learning process is so crucial. And many parents don't have the opportunity to step back and reflect and get this kind of support. Parents learn how to do this always, anyway, on their own, in the best way they possibly can. But I think, again, more self-reflection and more authenticity, from the professional community is really going to help um, families in
Because that
ways that,
stuff's going on anyway in your mind, isn't it? Whether you're aware of it or not, you've got that stuff going on. In this case, it was, what are you doing? Why are you attacking me? I'm trying to help you. Why are you letting me down? It might have been. Why are you victimizing me? Or whatever it is in each person's case. If we're not aware of it, that's going on anyway. And if we're not aware of it, the response that we give is going to be from that place. We're going to be unconsciously, totally unconsciously, because we never do it on a conscious level, treating the child as an enemy, treating the child as somebody who's attacked us. We're the victim, they're the perpetrator of something bad. And that's going to come out in how we respond, and there's going to be conflict. When you became aware of that, and when you slowed your breathing down, you were aware of what you were thinking, you were able to, when you were aware of it, you're able to check, actually, is this true or not? Is this reasonable or not? What's really going on here? And when you were able to do that, I sort of want to ask you, what was different for Sherry, who's not really called Sherry? What was different for her?
it's amazing, Guy, because, you know, um, I may get emotional thinking about her because she had such a huge impact on me. But in part, what happened was that um, we we developed such a close bond and relationship with each other, um, in many ways that I couldn't have ever imagined, right? So what happened was that she actually, I think, began to trust more that I could be an anchor for her as well as for myself. Um, and then what happened was she began to just be so much more connected to me
Yeah.
and available for interactions with me. I mean, we had so many more interactions after, once I started doing this more internal work, where we would just, I mean, she would start laughing, and she didn't have any, she wasn't a speaker. She didn't have the use of language to communicate, but she communicated in very deep and powerful ways. Um, but we would just laugh together,
Yeah.
and I would sing to her, and we would. I mean, it was just this, and I didn't even recognize what she was capable of, and the depth of the connection that we could have,
Yeah.
until I began to drop down in many ways from my head into my heart, and realize that I was really there with her and with myself, because I wasn't stressed and I wasn't thinking, how do I do this and what's wrong. Um, so in many ways, it was the beginning of a very deep bond that developed between us. And it's not that we didn't have hard moments. I mean, it did. It's not like she didn't still have the same really significant um, emotional regulation challenges that she had. But it's that I think I also developed more confidence in my own ability to be an anchor, and she developed more confidence in my ability to be an anchor, and I think then also in her own ability to anchor herself.
Yeah.
So it was this really amazing. Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, I miss her. I haven't seen her in many years, and she's now a whole lot older than she was. But it was such a powerful set of lessons for me, and I've carried that with me. Right? She had a really huge impact on me.
And that
Um,
transformation happened because you were able to stop, understand where you were coming from, understand what was going on for you, question it, and therefore keep yourself calmer. So you were not projecting negative energy towards her. You were not treating her as if she was an aggressor of some sort. Even in, you would never, I'm sure you would never do that in terms of pointing a finger at her and saying you're an aggressor, but it would have been there in the, in the background, and she would have picked up on it. That wasn't there. So therefore you were safe, and you were a safe person for her to be with. And to know that she could get through that situation without it being escalated more than it needed to be. That's a brilliant story. I mean, I can give an example on a much much smaller, much less dramatic, much more mundane level, which is, just recently, my son, we were going to go out somewhere. I was going to take him out somewhere, and we had to be there at a certain time. And he kept finding things to do, finding reasons not to. He needed to go to the toilet for a long time and then do something else and something else that was absolutely essential in that moment. And I found myself getting stressed about that. And I decided at some point, I was either going to explode or I was going to sort of change my attitude. So I just checked in with myself. I noticed that, I was getting stressed. I was feeling that it was my responsibility to get us there on time.
Mm.
And I was sort of no longer in tune with him. I wasn't listening to him anymore. I was just trying to hurry him along. And all of the valid reasons, or at least in his mind, there were very valid reasons why he shouldn't go out now. I was dismissing them. And I was saying, and then he's going to end up feeling unheard and dismissed, which autistic people have all through their lives. And it's something, it's not a small thing. It's something that's going to build on previous experiences of being unheard and dismissed. And it was just going to escalate into something terrible. So instead, I just changed. When I was able to be aware of what I was thinking and of my driver to be there on time, I could then drop that driver. And that doesn't mean we didn't try to get there on time, but it meant that that wasn't the only priority. He was my priority as well, and I could coach him and try to help him to be there as fast as possible, but without putting pressure on him that was going to sort of hold him back, because, it would have just been, we would have been much, much later anyway, and without ignoring him and still acknowledging him. So I did that, and we were late, but probably less late than we would have been if I'd been fighting him, because it turned into something that would have taken up much time. We were late, but we got there as a unit, we were still connected. It had no lasting damage on our long-term relationship because there was no enmity there. There was no pressure there. We talked about it. We talked about, the importance of being on time and things like this, but in a totally supportive way. So the whole thing went smoother. We were late, but we would have been just as late, at least, if not much more late. But the most important thing is we did it harmoniously.
That's beautiful, Guy. And the theme again is the togetherness part that you were able to get to as you kind of, again, slowed yourself down, just reflected. Okay, hold on, like you checked in with yourself, right? In those moments where you were starting to get geared up or escalated. And I honestly I think, Guy, that is a lifelong journey and process.